see, they're like, cool, I want to do that again. It like releases the endorphins, and people are like, yeah, this is great. Agile's cool because I'm good at it, right? And so I don't know. I've seen in terms of minimal viable frameworks, I've seen, people come and just start with a board and just start with some foundational agility talks and start with the sprint zeros and sort of the trading wheels, very simple approach like that. And that seems to go really good. And as with anything that's transformative, you want to be deliberate and very cadenced and consistent with your communications and your actions, right? You're going to say things and then you're going to follow through. Those are all key pillars. And I'm going to pause and throw it over to you, Duncan, because I will go on and on and on if someone doesn't stop.
Well, I think lots of great points there. I think what I heard there is that it's all about the people. So if you start out with the mechanics, here's the program board, here, this is how we're going to arrange the sort of value streams and this and that. Well, apart from anything else, people might push back, people might wonder what's going on. So, building those connections with the people, getting the intent, I guess, sort of secured first of all. And probably, as you say, starting with the board, starting with whatever that looks like, whatever the leadership team is that's in place. And I think at that point, you're building that relationship can then expand out to the rest of the team. And hopefully you can avoid some of the common sort of pitfalls and traps maybe that we can talk about in the next sort of section.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, so getting that sort of rapport, I guess, sort of working out the outcomes as well. Why are we scaling? Why do you want this big picture or this big sort of diagram? Why do you think this is a good idea to sort of get to work with your teams?
Yeah, and I can't exactly yes to all that, and I can't stress enough even looking at this diagram here that's being presented. For someone who's out of the mix of sort of software, if we're going to use software development as an example here. If they don't really know the mechanics of how that works, of how to produce software, and they definitely don't know anything about agility, whether it be business agility or any other facet of agility, you're going to scare them away. They're going to see this and just start getting on their phone and multitasking because it's just too much. And that's usually how they respond. And so however you can kind of, again, feed that success, that intrinsic success factor for people, I think all the better. And it also, and it's going to give you, it's going to help everybody, right? Because it's going to ultimately be successful. And, I can't tell you how many times I've had people come at me and say, well, I was at X company and we tried Agile there and it was a disaster. And here I am, brand new person, brand new company, and they're turned off to it because they had a bad fire hose experience.
Bad experience a couple of years ago. Here we go again. Yeah, absolutely. I think part of mitigating that is first of all getting the knowledge. Getting the often when agile transformations fail, it's because some bright spark said, right, we're all going to do Scrum. Tomorrow. That's sprint planning. That was your training. Fingers crossed. Hope for the best. And what a surprise! A few months later, it all falls apart, and maybe all the practices were in place, but none of the intent was there, and people don't know why they're showing up to meetings, and it's just things that get a bit unraveled. So I guess sort of coming back to the question, where do you start? Once you've developed those relationships with the people that want to implement it, the next step is to design an effective transformation. What are the sort of steps that we're going to go through? And you can draw on various sort of things there. You can draw on sort of Kotter's 8-step sort of stages, or you can sort of look at the SAFE, sort of implementation roadmap. But what it all comes down to is making a plan. Maybe that's a bit strange from an agile consultant to say you've got to have a plan. And of course you can change that plan, but I think you've got to know how you're going to sort of roll things out. What people are we going to work with? What might the teams look like, or how are we going to decide how the teams are going to look? Probably that's going to take a month or two, maybe a few revisions. Well, we could do it like this. I don't know about you, but whenever I've been in that sort of pre-phase, there's always been meeting after meeting. Well, we could have the teams organized like this, or we could have it like this, or we could have a couple of bits here and a couple of bits there. Going through that, I think giving it a bit of thought, giving it a bit of attention, I think is key.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Absolutely. And then inviting people in. So it's like, this is a thing I helped make. And that sort of, again, back to those intrinsic qualities, that would be ownership. And, you made me think of something else, is if there's any way you could find these sort of hell yes people early on, or the eager adopters, as I like to call them, all the better, because then they'll be
Yeah.
singing those praises. People will be like, well, what are you talking about? What's that over there? And maybe they already have respect and rapport with other people in their vicinity, right? And then they hear that, they get curious, right? So that's something that's been very significant in my experience. Probably, again, going back to the thought about it's all about people. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. So develop some relationships, start with the board, work out how you're going to sort of socialize that out, make a plan, do a bit of design, do a bit of, a bit of thinking, how is this going to look? And then I guess, sort of communicate it out, help the sort of organization to communicate that plan to whatever it might be, whatever you've sort of decided, roll it out in a sort of clear, systematic way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another plug for minimal viable framework.
Absolutely, yeah. One thing that people often sort of misinterpret about these big frameworks is they often have big pictures with 20 or 30 or 40 elements in them. Most of them, you don't have to do everything. So having, I think SAFE says there's about 10 elements which you must do if you want to, sort of say that you're sort of doing SAFE. There's certain things that you really kind of have to have. You're not really doing SAFE if you don't have a planning session, a sort of PI quarterly sort of planning session. But right. Most of the sort of stuff on that sort of picture is stuff that you gradually add into it, maybe over years, and maybe there are bits that you never do. If you don't have 5,000 people, you probably don't need the large solution bits. But as you say, having that sort of minimum viable framework, enough to address the problems, which are usually things like coordination and dependencies. And if you can sort of get the things that address those things, you can then build on it.
Absolutely. And to go off that, it's just kind of, what I found, and actually I've kind of thought about even writing about this topic because I really think about it a lot, is oftentimes you'll see people look at frameworks as a destination, and it's not, right? All it is a starting point for, driving better ways to work for better outcomes, right? At the end, it all comes back to outcomes. But this is sort of, maybe souping up the engine that you have in your, in your car, so to speak, or, kind of refinement, that sort of something to give it some sort of boost, right? It's not the end game. So to say, like, we're a SAFE organization, well, you practice agility, SAFE is your fuel, right? It's not the destination. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Well, that was a nice sort of warm up onto the topic. Why don't we see if there are any questions in the Q&A? So we're being produced here by another person called Jess, so apologies for the confusion there. But Jess from Agility in Mind, do we have anything in the Q&A?
Yes, we have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, we are doing Scrum well with multiple teams. What are the indicators that show we need to start using a scaling framework?
Good. Do you want to take that one, Jess?
I don't believe I've ever been asked this. So in terms of, so they're kind of doing Scrum, and in terms of the time box, I'm thinking of general Scrum boilerplate. Honestly.
So I guess when would you, like, you've got a few Scrum teams kicking about, what would be the trigger to say, now is the time that we should, now is the time that a scaling framework might help, or,
I think the trigger that comes to mind is if you have the core pieces that are the minimum requirements of that framework. I wouldn't say, as long as that box is checked, whenever you're ready, right?
So I think the question says, we are doing Scrum well with multiple teams. I guess one thing is that if things aren't broke, don't fix them. If you're happy with what's going on, if you're happy with the way things are going, I guess the indicators for me to show you need to start using a scaling framework is where things are not going that well, when there are problems, essentially. I think the basic problems that most scaling frameworks solve, certainly initially, are basic things like alignment, dependency management. So if maybe the sort of trigger would be if you find that you're getting that situation where maybe multiple teams are doing things and depending on the other, and team 6 are saying, well, we could really do a team 5 to do that, but they're already doing something for team 4 and they sort of promised us this and that, then that's happened. And perhaps if the different product owners or product leaders in those different teams are struggling to make their plans, or are surprised when they ask a team for something and it's not quite sort of there. I guess, the short answer is, if there is something wrong, if there is something that is not going that well, that might be the time where you might look at a scaling framework. Maybe it wouldn't be the solution, but maybe, if you can sort of think, well, this scaling framework has a way of dealing with this problem that we have, that maybe that might be a good trigger. Good. Anything else in the Q&A, Jess?
Great. Yep. Another one is, we are doing Kanban. Can we or should we scale that?
Interesting.
Well, I have a question. Are you nailing Kanban? Because you should nail it before you scale it.
That's true. Yeah, I think a lot of the scaling frameworks say, you can't scale rubbish. There's a lot of sort of, so I guess if you're doing Kanban, yeah, that's a good point. Nail it. Make sure that's working really well. There's a lot in Kanban I think people overlook, isn't there? It's more than just having a board and moving things from stage to stage to stage to stage. There's a huge amount of rich sort of practice, arising from lean and arising from, those sort of ways of thinking. That, as you say, if you're right at the top of your game, I guess Kanban scales itself quite naturally. There's no fixed structures in Kanban to begin with, so it's perfectly possible to have a big,
What I would add is, if you use lead time and cycle time, which are the go-to metrics, if as it were for Kanban, if you were able to achieve your goals around those and pretty consistently, then maybe you might have something. You can kind of wash, rinse, repeat, and put that over there, that organization. But I would make sure that those two metrics are consistent for a while, like it's consistent in terms of your achieving success with them. And then maybe think about saying, okay, I like that, and I'm going to start doing that over there.
Yeah. But I guess in some ways the answer is similar to the first question. Is there a problem that needs to be solved? If not, stick with Kanban. If you've got Kanban working well, again, if you're doing Kanban, should we scale that? So I guess the only time you would is if you're not happy with what's happening. I think generally speaking, scaled frameworks have higher overheads than small groups of teams or even single teams. Probably the cheapest way, the most effective and cost-effective way to develop any software product is with a single, high-performing, highly sort of mature, disciplined, agile team of some flavour. If you get, a sort of smaller outfit, one or two people, you're going to sort of, struggle with diversity of experience and not have insights and different sort of opinions and different sort of things feeding into it. But with a single team, you get that sort of diversity, but you haven't got the overheads of, for example, having pre and post planning things or having synchronization sort of things that you need to add in, deciding who's going to get which bits, having dependencies to sort of manage across teams. Scaling frameworks address those problems well, but it would be better and cheaper, frankly, if you could build something just with a single high-performing team. Good. Anything else in the Q&A then, Jess?
Yeah, we have another one. So are there any strategies we can employ or best practices to delay scaling, such as better decoupling of team dependencies?
Interesting, yeah. So I guess there's a couple of things there. How do you get each team working effectively? I guess kind of related to that sort of discussion we just had. And then how do you get to the stage where even if you've got 10 teams, you don't need to have a scaled framework for them to coordinate around, avoiding those inter-team dependencies.
Yeah. And if you're lucky enough to have even a semblance of an idea of what all your dependencies are, even I would say 60% accuracy, that's awesome for one. Good job if you're able to identify those. And from that, really I would encourage root cause analysis. So like if you have if a team has a dependency on another team due to skill sets, for instance, looking upskilling, perhaps a sort of a dojo immersive learning program would be the right choice. Maybe it's, training, I would certainly employ a skills matrix to visualize where that particular team's skills are and where they need to be, that type of thinking, sort of like I see a lot, and you'll see this with even run boards too, going more into risk and dependencies, but you'll see them just listed, and then don't forget about those. Run those down, really do a root cause, and see what you can do to eliminate them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think sometimes a phrase which is very overused in agile communities, but is actually the solution to many problems, is this idea of self-organization or self-managing teams, and the idea of delegating responsibility, sort of to the people that are actually sort of doing the work. I think that can often help in those situations. And it's the sort of thing that's easy to waffle on about in a webinar, but actually really hard and actually quite rare to get done in practice. So having a department of 100, 200, 300 people, where perhaps you have a portfolio of different products where there are distinct enough that you don't necessarily need a scaling framework for each one, trying to get 300 people to be able to take control and maybe handle their own dependencies, I guess might be a sort of good fit for that problem. That requires significant leadership and significant sort of coaching and guidance and will, I guess, from the sort of people that are doing it. I've got to say, I rarely see it. It's not something that I can sort of rattle off half a dozen anecdotes and say, yeah, it happens all the time. It's one of those things that is if you ever get it, cling onto it with everything that you've got. Don't let anybody do a reorg and, sort of protect that sort of asset. I think it can be a powerful thing. Good. How are we doing then, Jess? Any more questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, one more has popped up. Do scaling frameworks fit well with quarterly planning?
Good. What do you think, Jess?
Quarterly planning. Hell, it's better than annual planning, so I applaud you there. So the first thing I think of with quarterly planning and scaling frameworks is SAFe's program increment.
Yeah.
And I've seen it work pretty well in the past. If your cadence is quarterly. So that would be, so I guess my answer is yes, it can, especially because it brings, it has that ability to bring multiple organizations together and kind of be on the same sheet of music. Yeah.
We had a client a few years ago where we were kind of rolling out Safe, but to be honest, we didn't want to bother them with all the terminology. They were sort of happy enough with terms like quarterly planning and sort of the sort of basic stuff like that. We didn't really want to introduce terms like PI planning and release train engineers and things like that. So I think it's all in what you mean by quarterly planning. If quarterly planning implies fixed budgeting cycles where you have to say up front what you're going to get in 3 months' time, you can kind of do it, but it doesn't necessarily fit well. On the other hand, if quarterly planning is just making a plan for the quarter with a view to keeping track of it, responding to change and dealing with situations that they arise, perhaps with an aim to increase predictability, try to, it would be a good result if you could do plans for a 3-month period and deliver 4/5 of what you set out to do. That is a sign of a relatively mature and also probably a fairly stable organization with fairly stable requirements. So yeah, I think it's all in the detail, isn't it? How exactly you do it and what exactly the constraints are that you're working within. Good. Okay, let's move on to the next topic then. So, what pushback is to be expected by stakeholders, sponsors, and people invested in the current ways of working? How can we avoid getting derailed? What are your thoughts on this, Jess? Have you seen any pushback?
Never. Everyone always just goes right along with the plan, right? No. So from a sponsorship, high leadership perspective, it is 100% ROI driven almost every time. Okay, great. They want to know how long, they want us to put a time on how long it's going to take to transform, things like that. So there's a lot of rapport building and trust that needs to happen at that level, just to get checks signed, right? With that, in my past, I've convinced by doing these are the things that I've used, these tools, in order to convince leaders and sort of that nod and say, okay, we're good to go. And that is, if you happen to have someone in your network from a comparable company, in size that could come in and do like a Q&A like this and say, yeah, Jess and her team came in and this is why agility is so awesome, and sort of sing your praises, and we can kind of have a dialogue. That's really cool. The other thing is, hey, Jane, leader, give me 6 months. If I don't blow your mind, then you were right. And that has, back in 2011, I used that tactic, and they're still, I would say they're an agile organization. They still more than embrace it. In fact, they contribute to meetups and they're really enthusiastic about it. But it was that sort of a show me, let me prove it, that sort of mentality, and that seemed to do it. Now, for people who are I feel like that's easier to convince check signers and approvers and stakeholders sometimes than the people who are veteran developer who's been working 20 years and what I do works. I'm going to retire in 5 years. Why? Get out of here. I've had those sort of naysayers. And the only way that I've been able to convince them is showing them. Be persistent, be respectful, meet them in the middle, be empathetic. And, I'll sit there and shoot out COBOL memes and chit chat with them about the old days, get in, and then they're able to listen to you a little bit more. And it's not an overnight thing. You got to have patience and persistence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's perfectly valid to recognize that people might not want to do the big next shiny thing. If people are happy, if people are confident and know what's going on in the way that they're working now, I guess you've really got to prove why they should care, haven't you? If you're a developer retiring in 5 years' time, perfectly happy, every day you come in, you get to do some relatively interesting things. Why would I do this new thing that you're sort of telling me all about? If you're a sort of a finance director that has all the sort of budget worked out, you've got clear procedures in place, you can look at your sort of dashboards, your spreadsheets, and know what's going on with great confidence. If you're proposing a different way of going about budgeting, that's going to create alarm. That's going to, well, if we do this, I no longer know for sure that when I sort of present my end of year reports, things are going to be okay, and can I justify the things that I'm accountable for and need to sort of do. So there's got to be a bit of a barrier of excitement. Why what's the benefit? Why would we do this sort of thing? What might life be like if we sort of go for it? And again, coming back to what you were saying before, you don't have to go full guns, sort of value stream allocation and sort of participatory budget funding and all the sort of, sort of stuff right at the top of the chart in SAFE about, sort of the way that budgets are handled. Maybe that's a year or two down the line. You don't have to sort of dive straight into that right from the beginning, but just sort of starting out with some basic planning practices, and then as time goes on, trying to, evolve the technical practices, the budgeting practices, the product planning practices. I think that's, as you said, that's the way to go.
Yeah, make it easy, right? I mean, that's the best way to convince anyone of anything. If you can deliver the information, like if you're talking to a high leader, and depending on how your finances or structures in the company, and I could say in 6 months, give me X amount in CapEx spend. They like that a lot more, that top line, than bottom line. So that kind of, okay, I think you start putting the pieces together for them, and then they can't pick it apart, and they're like, you know what, let's try it, There was something else I was going to add to that. I just lost it. I hate when that happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it'll come back later. I beg my...
Maybe.
Yeah.
Why don't we see if there's anything in the Q&A while we sort of ponder that. So, Jess, do we have anything in there?
Yep, we've got a couple coming through now. So, as you described, people find change difficult for many reasons. What are the biggest two hurdles you see with people and teams in adopting Agiles at what level? And what are the biggest two confident boosters you have found in scaling Agile?
Interesting. So what are the two biggest hurdles, and then what are the two biggest confidence boosters that you can sort of overcome those hurdles? I'll tell you what, Jess, we could do one each, couldn't we?
Yeah.
So in terms of the biggest hurdles, what are the biggest sticking points in your experience? Well, we would, if only...
Oh, so for leaders, this is going to sound so funny, and it kind of goes into what I forgot earlier, but just getting time with them, right? Just getting on their calendar. So like perfect the art of, your elevator speech, your lightning talk, right? If you can get 10 minutes with them, 5 minutes, and get them reeled in and interested, that's been a big hurdle for leaders right there. It's like, if I could just get some time with them, I know I could convince them, right? So that's something to call out. And I kind of talked about earlier about the ROI perspective from leaders, and then down in the team in terms of, it's the old sort of closed mindset individuals. Right, you?
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar, but maybe sort of even a bit more mundane. It's just about the logistics. So if you're sort of doing some sort of transformation, so last time, for example, we did a SAFE transformation. The biggest hurdle was literally just agreeing on the dates, and then once we had the date, for the first PI planning session, dealing with a constant swarm of, well, can we just move it back a week, or can, that I got a holiday, my team over here, one of the developers is going to be away that day, can we move the whole thing? Just the sort of really mundane details for just getting started, getting over that line, having that first sort of flagship sort of planning session, getting that sort of sorted out. And I think the maybe not a confidence boost, but a solution, a way to overcome that is to just draw a line in the sand, say that's when it's going to happen. Maybe spend a week or two. What's the best date that we have available, and then just stick to it. Say that's when it's going on. We're not going to move it. Even though you're team 7, 2 of your developers they've got a holiday booked. They'll catch the next one. The rest of the team will just have to sort of catch them up, and then next time that it'll be in the calendar and it'll be a bit more sort of secure. So just getting started, just saying that is when we're going to do it. Don't worry. I guess the confidence booster might be, don't worry. This normally happens. The first one isn't going to be perfect, but good news is, we'll get the momentum going. We'll sort of get it better next time.
Yeah, that resolve and assurance goes a long way. For sure. I'm 100% with you. And really going back to sort of, starting small can mean big things in the end. So be as small as you can. And that way it's comprehensible. They're succeeding. They get it. That could, showing them that they're succeeding and progressing is a huge, huge confidence boost, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff. Anything else in the Q&A, Jess?
Yep. So assuming we have great Scrum teams, Scrum Masters and POs, we would have the basic skills. Would we have the basic skills to implement SAFE, for example?
Good. I would say yes. I've got to say, I think one of the things about SAFE, so this question is about SAFE in particular, is, SAFE invented maybe about 1% of the big picture in terms of stuff that they came up with. 99% of it is, great Scrum mastering, great product ownership, sort of Scrum teams, sort of, as well as other sort of practices, DevOps, XP, Kanban. If you're an experienced Agilist, implementing SAFE is probably, I imagine, if you go on a certified course, or if you sort of go through it, you'll probably spend most of the course thinking, oh yeah, I've been doing this for the last 10 years, or that's how it fits together. I think what SAFE does is it brings a lot of stuff together in a way that has been demonstrated to work quite well at scale. But I think if you're sort of thinking, well, I'm an experienced Scrum Master, product owner, Agilist, we have great Scrum teams. Yeah, you're 99% of the way there. It's just maybe a case of thinking maybe a bit more tightly and maybe a bit more rigorously about certain elements, such as the way that dependencies are managed or the way that different things are happened. But yeah, I think if you've got that experience, you're not gonna sort of stumble, I wouldn't have thought.
Yeah, that would certainly be an advantage. I agree with what you're saying, Duncan. And the core of agility, even in its essence, right? There's no failed experiments. There's only learning. So go at it. And what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Anything else in the Q&A, Jess?
Yep, so a couple more coming through. So someone's saying it took them a year to get pretty slick with Scrum. How long do organizations take to be proficient with less or SAFE on average? What's the learning curve starting from good Scrum?
Good. Oh, I think you're muted there, Jess.
Yeah, sorry. I think I misheard the first part of that, Jess.
Sorry, it says it took them a year to get pretty slick with Scrum. How long do organizations take to be proficient with less or SAFE on average?
Okay, so the individual, it took them about a year, and then they're asking, conversely, how long does it take organizations to be proficient with Scrum? Okay.
SAFE, yeah. So it took them about a year to get their Scrum team working well. From that point, how long might it be expected that they would take to become proficient at SAFE or
Gotcha.
less?
I got you. Ooh, I don't know. That's a good. Let me think about that because I've seen it go where it's been a couple years, and then I've seen it be about a year. So I would say 1 to 3 years if I had to put an average on it from my experience. Again, there's a lot of variables there, mainly the size of the organization being a very big differentiator. What do you think, Duncan?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think it's those variables. the sort of question says, it took us a year to get pretty slick with Scrum. Is that there's one Scrum team and you're just about to recruit another 5? Or is that we've already got a department where 8 teams have been getting pretty slick with Scrum, and now we want to apply a sort of safe or less wrapper around it? I think in that latter case, a couple of months is probably, it's just going to be getting a bit of structure to handle some of those dependencies. I think safe and less are good at asking the right questions at the right time, such as, let's make a plan for 8 to 12 weeks. Let's figure out in advance if there's going to be a clash, a kind of a resource conflict that needs to be dealt with. And if you're pretty slick with Scrum already, and if everybody was pretty slick with Scrum, you've got most of the mechanics in place, and it's just about tightening up on a few of those things. If, on the other hand, you've got one Scrum team today and you're going to recruit 100 people and form your first, sort of less or safe instance, that's going to be a bit longer. It'll take, as you say, sort of 3 years, 5 years to sort of really develop that sort of culture. And I guess it's maybe a bit of a curve. The initial benefits will ramp up quite quickly, and then it'll sort of tail off. It'll be about sort of pursuing those incremental gains. But it's a very, as you say, a very variable question. It depends a lot on the people, the sort of starting point, the sort of teams. But interesting question.
Great. We also have another one saying that the safe diagram frightens them. Is there a recognized safe light approach?
Good.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm just thinking of the configurations, that Safe offers on their site, and I'm thinking of the one on the farthest of the left. But let me think about that more. I'm trying to think, what would you do?
Yeah, that's true. Let me see if I can bring that up. So you're right, those sort of configurations might
Right.
be a good place to start. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like, even if, as Duncan looks that up, I mean, if you were to find like their most, Safe has these different levels of configurations from, massive companies that deal with multiple entities. There it is.
Oh, yeah. That's just gonna bring that
To
up.
smaller shops.
Yeah.
Even if you took the smaller shops approach, feel compelled to tweak that. It's your company. It's not Safe. So you don't have to follow and be prescribed to every little thing that Safe mentions. But yeah, here we are. Essential Safe. There it is.
Yeah. So this is the big picture. This is the big sort of scary thing. If you sort of trip over here, a little bit less daunting. And even then, there's a few bits here that are maybe not mandatory. I think there's like 10 mandatory elements. Things like having teams with Scrum Masters and having a release train here, doing PI planning. I forget where it is, but I think there's a checklist of sort of something like 10 bits that you have to have in place, and then you're doing the bare bones minimum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I agree with you in terms of there's a lot of like roles and stuff that might be switched around, like the lace and stuff. But anyway, what I'm getting at is if you can get your value streams mapped, whether you're a startup to a giant enterprise, that's incredible. That's powerful, because you are able to visualize from start to finish what the goal is of your organization, whether it is a simple, if it's an e-commerce store, your goal is to convert, right? You want sales. So what's that journey? And from there, you're able to, cut waste. You're able to, anticipate potential bottlenecks down the road, reconfigure, et cetera, et cetera. It's there and mapped out. So I would say that would definitely be, if you were to say Safe Light, I would say that's definitely one thing that I would require in Safe Light.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Okay. Well, we've got one more topic to discuss, and then we can sort of delve into some of those questions. So the next one was about momentum. So let's say we've overcome those hurdles. We finally convinced the finance director to fund a first sort of quarterly plan or a PI plan, whatever we sort of decided to call it. How do we sort of keep things going once that initial buzz has died down? How can those improvements be coordinated without descending into chaos?
Yeah, I'm glad that this question exists, because this is something that I've observed where there's a lot of hype in the beginning, and especially if you have a big push where you hire agile roles or you bring in consultants, and then it's hype, and then eventually it just like dies out. And I've seen that multiple times, and it's very, very key that we keep that momentum going, because again, it's not a destination, it's a journey. I mean, agility, it's not like you're just agile one day and okay, we're done, on to the next project. It's not something you complete. So I would go back to kind of my comments earlier about those eager adopters, those really excited people, making sure they're engaged all the time. If you can bring them in and you know, maybe help them, if they can be in and contribute to the, you know, improvements in terms of being contributors there, or beta testing, say, hey, what do you guys think about these ideas? Constantly try to refine and embody that innovation spirit. You know, center of excellences or community of practices rather go a long way. That way you can kind of keep that sense of community, whether it's a Slack channel, Zoom channel, and like a monthly, bi-weekly meeting. Just keep that chatter going, keep your relevance there. So I would say to refine, to kind of summarize that, sort of keep the chatter going and the relevance. Make sure you're constantly refining and innovating your framework and your workflow, and always looking for ways to sort of optimize the value stream, right? And optimize those outcomes, and then make sure you engage those champions, or the hell yes people, as I refer to them as.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess it's just sort of getting to that sort of critical mass where you're no longer having to cajole people and sort of get people right. Don't forget, you know, we're gonna gear up for the next planning session or this or that. You've got to get to that sort of stage where you're over the hump, where it becomes sort of self-maintaining. And you know, there are within the organisation there are people that know it's become the norm. It's become that sort of way of sort of working, which I think the first sort of 6 months of the sort of key time. And you know, that, as you say, lots of hype at the beginning. The first planning session goes well, probably the second one as well, you know, sort of 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks later, whenever that might be, probably that one is still fairly exciting too. You know, you get to, for the first time, do the inspect and adapt bits and review what happened and see, right, how are we going to sort of feed that into the next time. But it's that sort of period around 6 months after you start, that's where potentially things could just start to fall away, and maybe the key stakeholders don't turn up anymore, and that excitement sort of dies down. So that's that. I think that's the time you've got to just get leadership, really. You know, leadership from the sort of the transformation agents, leadership from the organization as well. You know, that's the time where you go back to the board and say, look, this is the key time. This is the, you know, the message to send out now is, this is now the norm. You know, when stakeholders say, oh, you know, I've got this client thing, can I just, no, this is important. You know, this is where we're having this sort of key discussions. So I think, you know, getting the backup of somebody senior, like, you know, somebody on the sort of C-suite, maybe even the CEO, depending on the size of the organization, to sort of send out that message, I think is usually pretty good.
An executive or leadership or member of leadership who happens to be your champion is extremely powerful, and keeping them engaged early and often. And I mean, again, getting time with them, maybe it starts to dwindle and it's like, well, I'm on to other things. No. Like, you know, be persistent, make sure, even whether it's calling, going and knocking on their office door, whatever it takes, but this is crucial to their company's success. I mean, if you just set it and forget it and say, this is our cadence, these are the things we need to work on, this is our value stream, great, we did all this work, I'm going to walk away. And it's not an everyday thing you prune and refine. If you don't do that with some cadence, you really put your company at a significant risk of being stale, not truly practicing business agility, getting behind the 8 ball when it comes to technology. And it's the more and more technologically diverse the world becomes every day, I almost challenge people to think, what company isn't technical? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it would be rare. Like maybe a plumber, maybe, I don't know. I'm really struggling with trying to find an industry that is exempt from technology.
Well, I guess technology, you can define technology as just the tools and the way that you go about solving a problem. So a spanner is technology, you know, so even the plumber, he needs, you know, fair enough. He needs the blowtorch, he needs the that sort of stuff, you know.
Well, yeah, and in the cams that you put in the pipes and stuff. Anyway.
Well, yeah, exactly that, yeah. Good. Feels like we need some questions. How are we getting on in the Q&A, Jess, for this last section?
Yeah, we've got one that's just come through now. So can we grow existing staff into some of these new roles? I.e., can a Scrum Master be trained to be the release trained engineer? What kind of support, coaching and training do organisations usually need to make this a success?
Well, fingers crossed for them. What do you think, Jess? Do we need to get rid of the entire sort of management team and recruit new release trained engineers, or might it be possible to do a bit of cross-training?
Perhaps. What was the first part of that question? I apologize.
That's all right. Can we grow existing staff into some of these roles, into the new roles?
Okay, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I think so. And I've seen that done successfully. Again, same sort of mindset, attitude stuff I talked about earlier with patience and empathy. Be very transparent about, hey, this is what this role entails. So if you're a project manager going to become a project owner, really highlight the differences. This is, you got to kind of not manage people and resources or elements of the project and sort of get them product thinking and getting them training and skilled up. And then as long as they're eager and have the willingness, that's the key, right? If they don't, I would strongly encourage them to think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there was a similar sort of discussion, decades ago when sort of Scrum first came along. What are we going to do with our project managers? Do they all just become Scrum Masters? And the answer then is the same. I think a relevant answer here as well. It's probably, but you've got to do it on a case-by-case basis. Not every single Scrum Master is going to make a good release trained engineer, just as not every project manager would make a good Scrum Master. You've got to look at the particular skills, the particular sort of capabilities. The answer is almost certainly that if you have a big organization already with many Scrum Masters, the odds are that several of those people are probably going to be pretty good candidates to be a release trained engineer. So you're going to look at the sort of skills, the sort of capabilities, the ability to coordinate lots of stuff and sort of lead in the sort of the delivery practices in an organization, to be comfortable facilitating workshops with hundreds of people in the room. Whenever you're sort of making that decision, who's going to be the release trained engineer, you look at the role, you look at the situation, you say, well, is there somebody here that, or there are people here that might do a good job? If so, great. If not, might it help to bring somebody in? And then in terms of sort of training and sort of coaching, it's just that. I mean, there are courses you can go on. If you want to be a release trained engineer, you can go on a course just for that. Getting some experience helps. Getting some external advice always helps in that situation.
Yeah. And right now, I actually, it's funny, we're talking about this because, certs are awesome. There's all kinds of certs, based on roles like you're saying, and it's great to kind of give you an introduction and that foundational knowledge about what's to be expected from that role. Right now, I have a mentorship going with a mentee who's a project manager. She is her PMP. She's kind of been a project manager for a long time and really into that. But then she's realized there's been more interest over the last few years in Scrum Masters and product ownership and these other roles, right, that are more agile focused. And I have her attending a couple of the meetings of a really, really good Scrum Master that we have. And they've kind of buddied up, and he's kind of saying, hey, this is how I prepare for that meeting. This is how I facilitate stand-up, refinement, planning, just to give her a good glimpse of a day in a life. And that's been really, really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah.
Good. Any more in the Q&A, Jess?
Yeah, so my management are worried that scaling will regularly take the whole team out for planning and it's very expensive. Is the cost justified?
It's probably the most common question I get in a safe class. What do you mean take the 100 people out for 2 days? Surely we can just send a representative from each development team. Surely half a day would do. What do you think? Is it worth the expense?
I would be lying if I said I didn't ask that sometimes. However, if it's done right, if it's not done right and we're kind of going through the motions, that's a problem that needs to be called out. Program increments can be highly expensive, from not only taking people's time away from their regular work, but the travel, you might fly people in, and the catering, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's done right, I always think about it, things like this the other way. So what if we don't get everyone together? What if we don't do that team building? What if we don't get the right minds in the room to make sure we have all the risk and dependencies identified, or, the particular, features and releases we're thinking about? The cost of that is significant. And if you don't get them in a room to sort of dedicate time and attention and thinking to that, you're gonna miss something. If you try to like do it in between Zoom calls and just throw it on a board, or you know what I mean. And so I would say think back to, maybe you can pull some historical instances or data to say, this is where we were, this is where we are now. Look at the these outcomes that are really cool that we achieved, and the success and the happiness of our customers, or however you measure, right? And do a comparison there to see, maybe it is worth it, maybe it's not the way you're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I think the question itself is interesting. It's about the cost of those 2 days. Sometimes I sort of highlight the cost of the next 3 months, and the fact that those 2 days are about making the most of the enormous resources and expense that go into what everybody is then going to be doing for the 8 to 12 weeks. Sometimes I sort of try and get them to work it out. How much does it cost you to run your departments for 3 months? And it's usually, approaching the sort of tens of millions of sort of euros, pounds, sort of dollars sort of figure. So then the question is it worth, taking 2 days out to think carefully about how we're going to spend £10 million? Sometimes the sort of numbers help to justify the cost.
I love that, and I'm going to steal that going forward. So that's more, I'm more backward looking, but I love your forward looking, because you're like, in the grand scheme, this whole quarter we're spending 2 days. Yep, you're right. Mm-hmm. But that's a lot of resources, a lot of people, a lot of moving parts that we're not thinking methodically about for 3 months.
Yeah,
so
exactly, yeah.
The absence of it.
Imagine if you had $10 million to invest in the stock exchange. Would you justify spending 2 days researching the stocks that you were thinking about buying, and sort of deciding, is it this, is it that? I don't know, just half a day on Zoom calls, that'll do.
Exactly.
And so, oh no, I've lost all my money.
Oh no, you're absolutely right, and that really drives it home, especially if you put it in the context of the person having that much capital. First of all, I would need a day to come out of the coma from the realization that I had that much money alone. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. How are we doing, Jess? Do we have any more?
Yep, a couple more still coming through. So we have someone asking, is there a course or a qualification that can prepare me for having a discussion with management to convince them we need to scale?
Good question. I guess it might depend if you have a particular framework in mind. So if SAFE was what you were sort of trying to convince, I guess there is a course that is designed for that. Leading SAFE, might be a good place to start. But I guess it depends a bit more on, have you sort of arrived at the framework yet? Have you sort of decided which framework would be best? What do you think? What would be if somebody came to you and said, I want to go on a course so that I can have a discussion with my boss, what might you suggest?
Yeah, Leading SAFE. So I have my SBC. I took that class earlier in 2020. And you're absolutely right. There's a whole section in there dedicated to how to sell this, how to get buy-in from leadership so we can start and get it funded so we can start rolling. And that could be generic, just that section, to any framework. I like the way they did it, although that it might be pretty heavy in terms of going after that class to learn those skills, because that's not the most affordable class. You know what I mean? It's because it's a professional certification. It's sort of like it's a high certification for SAFE. So I'm trying to think outside of that. I know that LinkedIn Learning has a lot of stuff regarding that. I would certainly, definitely reference that. In fact, if you end up taking those classes on LinkedIn and succeeding with them, that could be a cert that's a little badge that's on your LinkedIn profile too, just a little extra. I don't know. I'd have to think more on that. Other than
I guess maybe sort of thinking outside of the question, maybe just a bit of one-to-one coaching might help as well. If you're preparing yourself for a discussion with your boss, as you say, leading safe, there is a bit in that that can help with that. But maybe I think there's another question about in the Q&A about how do I choose a framework. If you're still there, maybe a bit of advice from an external party, a bit of coaching, even just a sort of an hour or two, just to sort of talk it through. I'm sort of thinking about talking to my boss. Let's work it through. Let's work out what your plan might be. I think that's could be another route to take.
I love that, Duncan. And I, and if there's any way you can get someone who's at that executive level to say, hey, run this scenario with me, or someone who has experience with, it doesn't have to be executive because, again, hard to get on calendars, but someone in leadership is to really give you feedback and try to poke holes in it. You're absolutely right. That's solid. I think, honestly, that might even be better than going to get training in some ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Great.
So we've got a few minutes left then, Jess. Do we have anything else?
We have a couple more questions, so I'll quickly read them out. Who are the best examples of implementing scaling, which companies have really nailed this? How do I choose a framework? And my organization still considers Scrum to be cutting edge and new. Are these scaling frameworks established and have they been around long?
Interesting. Let's take that first one then. So best examples of implementing scaling companies that have really nailed this. I've got to say, as a consultant, I tend not to work with those guys. If they're nailing it, they don't need a consultant like me to help them. Have you come across any examples, Jess? Any cases you've maybe heard of? Or
so the first one that comes to mind would definitely be Spotify, which, just so you know, and I went to a talk with people from Spotify, and they hate that we reference them as the Spotify model. They're like, look, we're Agile. This is just
I read that blog as well, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so Spotify does a really good job. I would encourage people to research them. Panera Bread does a decent job. I worked with them for a short time as a consultant a few years ago. I know that they were looking at the DAD method, and they're a pretty agile forward organization. Let's see. I'm trying to think.
I know maybe for after the session, I know Scaled Agile do have quite a lot of case studies on their website. So maybe if I guess it's part of the thing of being a sort of consultant, as I say, if they're absolutely on fire, they're absolutely nailing it, they tend not to call us, do they? But I do know that Scaled Agile have quite a few, big flashy, high profile case studies up there. So I'd recommend.
You're right. No, you're right. That's a great resource, and yeah. I mean, obviously, you think of Apple, and they definitely got their product thinking down, but that's not scaling. So I'm just trying to parse through that question. Great.
Good. So the other question, Jess, was about an organization thinks Scrum is still cutting edge and new. Are these scaling frameworks established? How have they been around long? So I guess the history, Scrum's been around since the mid-90s. The SAFE, I think, from memory, correct me if I'm wrong, was around about 2010, 2011. So, sort of 15 years or so after Scrum. So Scrum is certainly not cutting edge, but I guess Scrum it just evolves so quickly. I think, the beauty of Scrum is it's so simple. Teams using Scrum today are cutting edge, even though the framework itself was created and has been modified a little bit, but essentially was created in its current form, more than sort of 20 years ago. So yeah, it's an interesting question. To be cutting edge or new, maybe is that the key ambition? Is that the sort of thing you really want to be able to do? But
yeah, I'm trying to think. Scrum. What was that? Sutherland, who helped found that idea. And you're saying the question was, can Scrum be leveraged to become cutting edge? Or I'm sorry, I got lost on that.
I guess somebody was asking if so their organization still considers Scrum to be cutting edge and new.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, our scaling frameworks equally well established, and that was the question.
Yeah. No, I agree with your sentiments then on that.
Yeah, good. So you can break that down, can't you? So Scrum, I would say Scrum is cutting edge, but it's just not new. Doing Scrum today, because Scrum doesn't say use cloud or use pair programming or use sort of CI/CD pipelines. It says nothing at all about that at all. But you can be doing cutting edge stuff like the most advanced sort of delivery pipelines, the most advanced tech that you've ever sort of used, using a framework that was created sort of 20 years ago. Good. Well, I think we're out of time for today's session. So thank you for everybody that's joined us today, and thank you very much, Jess, for the conversation. I very much enjoyed it, and I hope it was of benefit to others as well. For those that are here, you'll get a message shortly from my colleague Jess with a short feedback survey. So I very much appreciate your thoughts on that. But thanks once again, Jess.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great stuff. And thanks everybody else, and hopefully I'll see you again for another session.